But it turns out that people who are more trusting are likely to take risks in society, be more entrepreneurial, be more successful. And so we have to encourage that. I think of trust sometimes in terms of love, and I think of Shakespeare, who said that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all.
Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Samantha Hedges, Program Manager at Heterodox Academy. We just wrapped up our HXA Conference 2022. Thanks to those of you in the audience who are able to join us. And I'm excited tonight to continue our conference theme of renewing spaces of knowledge and trust with the topic Anecdotes to Polarization, Rebuilding Trust in a Liberal Democracy. If you are new to HXA's work, Heterodox Academy is a nonpartisan nonprofit committed to improving research and education by increasing open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in higher education. We have more than 5,400 members from institutions across the country and around the globe. If you're interested in our community, resources, exclusive events, and programs, it's free to join. You can visit heterodoxacademy.org/join to learn more. In the coming weeks, we look forward to sharing some content and material from the conference. Tonight, exploring our conference and summer theme of renewing spaces of trust and spaces of knowledge and trust, we will delve into how pluralism and civil discourse can help foster trust and understanding in a liberal democracy. I'll chat with my conversant, Ben Klutsey, for about 35 minutes, followed by audience Q&A. You can submit questions by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. As usual, we have a large audience. So we can't take all questions, but we will do our best to look for patterns and major themes. We welcome constructive disagreement, so feel free to ask questions that are challenging, so long as they're asked respectfully and in good faith. Now, I'm pleased to introduce my fellow conversant for the evening. Ben Klutsey holds dual roles at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. As the Director of Academic Outreach, he facilitates outreach to faculty leaders and university centers to foster collaborations and knowledge sharing about building academic programs. Through his role as director of the program on Pluralism and Civil Exchange, he works with partner organizations to foster a deeper understanding of pluralism and its role as a core attribute of a liberal society through research and communication, the practice of civil discourse and mutual forbearance, and the development and dissemination of tools for audiences across philosophical divides to model pluralism. He received his MA in International Commerce and Policy from George Mason University and his BA in Government and Philosophy from Florence University. Welcome, Ben, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Samantha. It's great to be here.
And we are happy to have you. So let's go ahead and dive into our conversation today. So I'm going to start off with a pretty broad question, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
So what is pluralism, and what does it look like in a liberal democratic society?
It's a really great question, and it's quite broad indeed. You're right. Pluralism is the sense that we can live together and coexist, even amidst differences, divides, and so on. John Inazu at University of Washington, St. Louis says that there are two important features of pluralism. The first is inclusivity, the idea that as a society gets more morally enlightened, we tend to include people who may have been formerly marginalized in society. So we expand the tent, if you will. And then there's another important feature, which is dissent. And that there will be people in the society who will disagree with various trends that others might consider, unproductive, and that's okay too. A pluralistic society isn't one that is simply diverse, although diversity is important, but a pluralistic society goes beyond diversity, and it requires some interaction, some engagement with the people who are different around us. And that is incredibly important. I'll also mention just very broadly, when we talk about pluralism, pluralism sits within a broader context of a notion or an idea called liberalism, right? It's really freedom and liberty. That's what liberalism is about. That's what this nation was founded upon. But liberalism has four corners. The first is economic, the notion that we have to allow each other the elbow room to pursue economic interests, to own property, exchange property for mutual benefit. There is also political liberalism. We have to allow one another, since we have equal dignity in a liberal society, to participate in a political process and to make our voices heard. There is also epistemic liberalism, the idea that we have to be able to think freely and express our thoughts as freely as possible. And then there's cultural liberalism, the idea that we get to practice our traditions, we get to adhere to the kinds of beliefs that we want to. And that is the stuff that pluralism really emerges from, because in a pluralistic society, people will have different belief systems, different ideological orientations, different backgrounds, and we have to figure out ways in which we can sort of coexist, live together, interact with one another. That's what I'd consider pluralism to be.
Thank you. That was a very broad yet also specific definition, which is going to be helpful for our audience, because I know oftentimes we throw the word around, but not everyone knows what it means or is on the same page. So that was helpful. So today, or this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are in the United States, we brought you on, or invited you to have this conversation to discuss distrust. So I'm going to come back to pluralism and liberalism, but first, can you share your thoughts on what do you think gives rise? So first, there's this idea observed that there's a decline of trust in institutions. Mm-hmm. So what do you think has given rise to that?
Yeah, so when we talk about trust, I will borrow from my friend and recent colleague, Kevin Vallier, who wrote the book, Trust in a Polarized Age. And in that book, he talks about, two kinds of trust. There is the, political trust, or, trust in government and governance. And that is the idea that people consider that the institutions of government will follow just and fair procedures, and that they will emerge with positive outcomes. Now, since the 1960s, when you surveyed the American people, they would say that they have about 70% trust in government. Today, that number is much lower than that, and I think we're looking at somewhere around 17% or so. So it's fairly low. Social trust, on the other hand, is the trust that, or the sense that our fellow members in society will follow certain established norms. And on that survey, you will see that there has been a significant decline in social trust. It used to be about 50% when they started the survey in I think the 1960s. Now it's roughly 30%. And Kevin looks across Western democracies and he says that, look, it is indeed the case that in many countries people have lost trust in government and institutions, but it's also the case that social trust has declined. But in America in particular, we have seen a precipitous decline like no other nation. So there's something interesting going on in the United States. When you delve a little bit deeper, you realize that partisan trust, or political partisan trust is moving a lot of the distrust that we have for one another. And if you look at surveys in 2016, for instance, and you ask people Do you trust, 70% of Americans, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, would say that they do not trust folks in the opposing party. So there is a lot going on that is quite politically driven. It seems as though our political identities are becoming a lot more dominant than other identities that we have. And so that is a little bit troublesome. It used to be that you simply disagreed with people who had different political views, simply, or you disagreed with the politicians who held the views. You disagree with the people who held those views. But now people simply distrust them because they feel as though certain norms, established norms, are no longer being adhered to. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And kind of to take this a little bit further, so, the institution, obviously the Heterodox Academy and our audience is interested in is higher education. So there's a sense that trust is declining in that institution as well. Do you have any insights on why that might be for higher ed in particular?
I have a couple of ideas, but I'm sure that others might have, more ideas about why that is the case. I think when you look at surveys across the board, including surveys that Heterodox Academy has, put together, you will notice that students on university campuses are self-censoring. Those numbers are increasing. And there is a fear that they would say something that would lead to canceling or shaming or calling out. And students typically want to fit in; they want to belong. And so there is a certain feeling that there are things that they could say that could get them into trouble, and so it doesn't feel like a space that allows them to speak freely. It is indeed the case that academics are worried that there are things they might publish that could get them into trouble, or things that they might teach in the classroom that traditionally would have been in line with the discipline, but could get them into trouble. And so there is a sense that speech is being constrained that is a little bit troublesome. There's a concept called preference falsification. This was coined by economist Timo Kuran. And the notion is that people mask their views due to social pressure. And it seems as though with some of the surveys that we're looking at across the board, students and academics are self-censoring and not expressing their views because they don't trust that the institutions of higher education will basically allow them to raise ideas that may be unpopular or challenge orthodoxy, contest ideas, which is unfortunate because the university is a place where people, at least traditionally, you'd go to learn, seek truth and knowledge. But the institution is changing, not everywhere, but there are some areas where it seems as though there are some challenges there. And so I think that's what's happening in higher ed in particular.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I just want to say a side note. There seems to be some sort of emergency going on. So if you hear ambulance or anything coming by, I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
So within higher education, I want to go back to this idea of pluralism and kind of tie it in, or perhaps tie it into what you just were describing. Institutions in society broadly, but also including higher education. What role does pluralism play in the decline of trust, and also perhaps the restoration of trust, if at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think pluralism, the idea that we encounter people who are very different from who we are. Naturally, human beings tend to be tribalistic. And I think we've been this way for a very, very long time. it's only fairly recently that we're trying to practice this type of a system where we get to live with people who are of different backgrounds and orientations. And since we like to, go with people who think like us and hang out with people who think like us and see the world the same way as we do, it does foster a lot of tribalism, regardless of the institution, even within higher ed, where faculty would probably recruit other faculty that have a similar worldview, and so that's where I think the challenge comes from. Naturally, we are predisposed this way, but the really neat thing is that we live in a system that was originally set up to bring together people who are different, right? E pluribus unum. And I think we can sort of lean into that idea a little bit and figure out ways in which we can enhance our ability to live together amidst deep divides. There are, John Inazu, as I mentioned earlier, talks about the legal aspects of the pluralism, and we have this with the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights and other provisions in our Constitution. But we also have the civic practices, and that gets into some of the things related to civil discourse and civil disagreements and engaging with one another in interactions and that type of thing. So that can restore pluralism, although baked in our human nature is the sense that we ought to be with people who are like us and you sort of think the same way and similarly and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that actually talking about kind of our tribal nature brings me to a question I had, or see if you can respond to. So for our audience, you were a moderator for one of our sessions at our conference recently, and during that session, you talked about this similar topic of trust. And one of the panelists, Emily Chomley Wright, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly, she described how liberalism creates pathways to both enjoy our tribal instincts and has institutions that force us to cooperate. So I'm curious your thoughts on that, as well as does higher education play a role in kind of this forced, for a better lack of a better word, cooperation in society? I know it's usually talked about as far as free markets are concerned.
Yeah, so what Emily was describing was sort of the broader context of liberalism that we get to enjoy, and it is the case that we have freedom of association. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the corners of liberalism is that we have cultural liberalism, which means that we get to associate with people that we want to associate with who have similar beliefs, ideas, ideologies, and that is wonderful. We have the space to do that in a liberal, pluralistic society. The cool thing, though, is that there are all these institutions that have helped us to broaden our radius of trust. And so, we have things like markets. Markets are interesting. One of my colleagues, or I should say two of my colleagues, Virgil Storr and Jeannie Choi, wrote a book called Do Markets Corrupt Our Morals? And in that book, they track a lot of democracies, a lot of market-oriented systems, having a more robust level of trust than other systems, which is that a lot of markets, you have interactions with people who are of different backgrounds, just by the nature of the marketplace and the way that trade and exchange occurs. You will have to go to the marketplace to purchase something from someone who is very, very different from who you are, and that repeated interaction helps you to get to know them better, You get to appreciate them. You get to recognize that they are very similar to who you are, and they care about their families just as you do. They worry about the same things just as you do, and that kind of repeated interaction helps to build trust. In terms of higher ed, higher ed is a place where I think, if I recall what Emily's point was, that it's a place where leaders and professors, faculty members can inspire students towards this sensibility of pluralism, and helping them understand that the contestation of ideas is what produces knowledge, and something that they ought to embrace and not to shy away from. And sometimes, there are some topics that are difficult, and so people get emotionally hijacked as a result. And it's about practicing, modeling it from the leaders of those institutions. And I think that does so much in inspiring young people towards a more pluralistic society.
Yeah, and with that, so this idea of civil discourse, which is also, a key component of your work. So getting people together who, may not have otherwise interacted, how do you do that in a way that fosters civil discourse and not just a constant butting of heads?
Yeah. When it comes to civil discourse, I like to turn to Adam Grant's book, Think Again. And in that book, he says, when people are confronted with questions about, their deepest beliefs, they can fall into three different categories, right? The preacher, the prosecutor, or the politician. And he says that the preacher is someone who is unyielding in their beliefs, and their goal is to proselytize and get people closer and closer to their side of seeing the world. The prosecutor is looking for weaknesses in their opponent's arguments, so that theirs would look much, much better. And then the politician is saying everything and doing anything to get votes and get people on their side. And I think we can all recognize ways in which we have been a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician. For me, my favorite movie is Gladiator, and so when that comes up, I'm certainly a preacher, and I'm unyielding in my belief that it's the best movie of all time. But not many people see it that way. And he says, look, there's a third category that we have to consider if we want to learn to interact and peacefully coexist with people. And it's almost like the scientist's mindset, to be just curious about the people that we interact with, and to ask questions about where they stand, their ideas, their beliefs, and we share ours as well, honestly, in good faith. And I think he used an interesting metaphor, and he says, you have to consider this not as a debate or as a battle or as a fight, but really as a dance. And think about, I guess there are different forms of dancing, but with a dance, one person steps forward, another person steps back, sometimes you each sidestep, and you treat these interactions not as one and done, but these interactions that you come back to over and over again, so long as you consider each other with due respect. And I think that helps us to begin to move the ball forward on civil discourse. I think we have to first get to know one another as human beings, as people. With in a democracy, we think of ourselves as being dignified equals, and that's how we have to consider each other. Another panelist, Robert Talisse, who joined us in the conversation, wrote a book called Overdoing Democracy. In that book, he says, democracy is a wonderful thing, and politics within democracy is also a good thing because it allows us to advocate for our positions, to champion the ideas that we care most about. But politics can saturate our lives in ways that can become extremely contentious. We've gotten to that point where we are at that very, very contentious place where politics is everywhere in everything that you see. And he suggests that in order to get back to civil discourse, in order to get back to trusting one another, we have to find, ways to do things with other citizens that have nothing to do with our politics. And he calls that, trying to explore citizen friendships. And I think that's a good place to begin, that each of us will have to figure out ways in which we can engage with our friends, our neighbors, people that we don't know. When you sit on a plane, don't be annoying, but you can, interact with someone very peacefully. And I think it's really a bottom-up experience. It's not something that can be forced on us top-down, but we all have to do our little bits.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually going to bring up what Robert had discussed because I thought that was a really important point. And by the way, I love your characterization of the different people or characters that we can be. I'm sure all of us can relate to that. And with, one of the things that Robert said that I really appreciated is, or maybe it wasn't him, but it came up during the discussion, that the power of having a beer with somebody, just sitting down, talking to someone, having nothing to do with politics. So with thinking about that, well, first, a side note to our audience, if you have any questions, please submit them. We're gonna get to those soon. So do you think that higher education can play that role of the place where people can get to know each other? Because a lot of times we talk about in classrooms, talking about controversial issues, deeply held beliefs, but that doesn't always have to be the case. That doesn't always have to be, kind of how we have practiced civil discourse. So is there any avenues in higher education that you think these kind of meetings of the mind or just getting to know each other can happen that don't center around politics?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think on college campuses, politics does come up a lot. I was reading Yuval Levin's book, A Time to Build. And in that book, he's talking about institutions and how institutions have been sort of, turned upside down, if you will. The institutions are meant to form us and develop us into these responsible individuals that are freely acting in society, but they've now become platforms for performance. And he talks about academia in particular as an institution that originally was meant to do three things. The first being, helping people professionally to develop the professional skills that they can use in the real world. Giving them a sense of or an awareness of morality and justice and challenges around the world. And I think that there's been a lot of that on university campuses. And the third thing is sort of the liberal education. And the liberal education being the ability to think critically, to contest ideas, as we've been talking about. And it seems as though the second point has taken over sort of the two areas, sort of the sense of morality and justice around issues that has motivated a lot of people. In some ways, I think that's a good thing because we need to be morally aware and keen towards fighting for justice and equality and things like that. But we also have to be very, very cautious that we learn the right ways to challenge ideas and be critical. And so, I remember when I was in college, my philosophy professor would oftentimes in essays or essay questions would say, the first section is making the best case, the best argument you possibly can for a particular point of view that you have picked that you want to address. And then the second part is to make the best possible case against the case that you have made, which supposedly, if it was a really strong case, then you'll have a really hard time challenging it. And he would note that, do not create a straw man argument for the original position. And obviously, we were all tempted to create straw man arguments, but you would lose a lot of points if you did that. And he was really pushing us to learn to think critically, and to learn to look at opposing views, right? As we know, John Stuart Mill said that, the ideas that we hold on to so strongly, if they're not challenged, we forget why we even hold on to those ideas, and they become dead dogma. And I think that the university is a place where we can learn to not hold on to dead dogma. We can learn to challenge ideas. And I think, there are all kinds of clubs, all kinds of groups on campuses that I think people can get involved in. There's sports. I think sports is sort of a great way to, kind of bring people together. We at Mercatus, we launched a project called the Pluralist Lab. The Pluralist Lab is an opportunity for students across the country to come together and talk about ideas that are potentially complex and controversial. But they spend about 3 days together, and they start off just trying to get to know each other, right? And the first day, we don't talk politics or policy or anything like that. We're just interacting and having a good time. And we do eventually on the second day talk about policy. But the idea is that we have to get to know one another as people first, so that when we are thinking of their ideas, we don't think of them as evil people or people that ought to be subject to hate, but people who just have very, very different ideas about the world. And the ideas that we have usually are informed by the stories and narratives that inform our views, because we've all had some experiences that do shape those narratives that inform our views. And some of the interactions involve learning about other people's origin stories. I think that alone makes a huge difference, just seeking to learn about others' origin stories. And I think it gives us a better sense of who they are and why they see the world the ways in which they do.
Yeah, thanks for sharing what Mercatus does in this regard, and the story about your experience with your professor, because I know we certainly advocate for those types of activities. We love talking about steel manning and the importance of that, and would love to see more of that happening on campuses. And actually, the first question we had come in is kind of related to this topic of civil discourse, and is something that a lot of members have brought up, not only to myself, but to other people on staff, which is, how do you deal with incivility? So how do we practice pluralism with those who are uncivil and unwilling to engage, and especially when those numbers seem to be growing, as in the number of incidences where that seems to be happening? Yeah,
it's a challenge. Should you be tolerant towards intolerant people? It's a difficult one. I don't think I have a silver bullet. I do think that staying on principle is always important. That it's almost like Martin Luther King and what he did. Regardless of the violence, decided to go forward with nonviolence. Obviously, it's a different context, but I'll go back to Johnny Nazu, who said that aside from the legal practices, there are these civic aspirations that we ought to aspire towards. And he says there's tolerance, humility, and patience. The first is the tolerance bit, and like tolerance towards someone who's intolerant is difficult. There's humility that we could all be wrong about the things that we believe in or we have thought about, but the patience part, I think, is an important one in this context of the question. because once we model the right behaviors, I think we can inspire people towards becoming more like us, I think. And it's difficult, right? When people are being uncivil and intolerant, but we are holding on to our position that this is the right way. And I think that these are the sensibilities that Emily Chamley-Wright was talking about, that we are almost sort of programmed in ways that we're just naturally predisposed not to get into a screaming match or behaviors that are untoward, but just really sticking to these core values of tolerance, of humility, and of patience, and that eventually the tide will turn. Now, I'm encouraged that there are a lot more organizations now who are involved in fostering civil discourse, and obviously Heterodox Academy is one. We have Braver Angels, we have New Pluralists, we have the Village Square, we have a whole host of organizations, and that gives me a lot of hope that eventually the tide will turn. Now, I mentioned earlier on that preference falsification is something that's happening. It turns out that most people want to be civil. Most people want to have good discussions. It's the extremes on both sides that dominate conversations, that get loud. And so we tend to think that a lot of people are that way, but that is not the case. We just need to give them a little bit more confidence to be confident pluralists, if you will.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this kind of came up during your conference session as well. Sorry, that's what I keep glancing over at is my notes from that. And Robert Talisse brought up the point about reciprocity. Mm-hmm. And if someone doesn't feel that reciprocity is being observed, then they are justified in distrust. So that, kind of brings us back to our topic of distrust. Do you have any insights on that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly we can decide that we don't trust someone who is behaving in an uncivil manner towards us, but we can still be patient with them. And I think that's, if we were to kind of stagger the values, I would say the patience should come first in this context. Yes, some people will give you reason to not trust them. And one of the points that Clay Routledge, the psychologist, made on the panel was that trust is reciprocal. But also, if we want to have a more trusting society, we almost have to take a leap of faith. It's the kind of thing that is challenging, but it turns out that people who are more trusting are likely to take risks in society, be more entrepreneurial, be more successful. And so we have to encourage that. I think of trust sometimes in terms of love, and I think of Shakespeare, who said that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And that sometimes we have to jump in and, trust people. Now, there are different levels of trust, I think, but you can give people the opportunity to do the right thing. Sometimes they may not, and you would have learned your lesson, but you can still be patient with them.
Yes, fair point. I also appreciated that contribution from Clay during the session. I took note of it. And so to get to an audience question that's also kind of continuing on this theme of trust and earning trust. If trust is earned, shouldn't a loss of trust in institutions be taken as a reflection of their trustworthiness? Should the loss of trust be an accountability mechanism that tells the institutions they need to improve?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. One of my colleagues, Martin Guri, wrote a book called Revolt of the Public. And in that book, he basically tracks the decline trust in institutions. If you go back decades and decades, and the mistakes that bureaucrats and government agencies and have made, going back to the war in Iraq, let's say, or the financial crisis where they said everything is going to be okay. And then we realized that the entire financial system has been flipped upside down. Or even with the recent pandemic, lots of information that we heard from the beginning turned out to be not necessarily inaccurate, but information, evolves. We learn more as time goes by, and it's not always easy to kind of transmit that to the general population. So people have reasons to not trust. Now, in fact, Americans have always had a healthy skepticism of institutions, which I think is not a bad thing, and it helps to build, helps to kind of force the institutions to become a lot more credible. And it's not just the government; it's academia, it's religious institutions, and we've heard about the scandals. So there's a lot going on that is affecting the ways in which we give trust to the institutions that govern the various spheres of our society. But I think this is where higher ed is important, because higher education is where we are raising the leaders of the future. And I think that's where we can encourage students to think very hard about their future professional experiences and how they can be ones to help to rebuild trust in the institutions that have lost it. Because I think this is a long-term, multi-generational project. And I think it's going to take every one of us to be a part of that.
Yes, definitely. So keeping with the higher education, so we had a question about the university, not so much the academic side, but other aspects. So we hear a lot about what can be done on the academic side, such as in the classroom, to foster these conversations. But what might university staff, such as marketing and communication staff, do to increase civil discourse and pluralism on campus?
That's a great question. We've been thinking a lot about language. You mentioned marketing, and so I'm thinking about language that helps us to engage in conversation and interactions. And we've noticed that with a lot of the organizations within the bridging movement, sometimes there are challenges in kind of bringing people, whether it's from the left or from the right, together, depending on how you frame a question or a topic or a theme for discussion. And so there's been some work going on about what's the right language to use about if for instance you're going to have a conversation about guns, if you're talking about gun control, it's very likely that there are people who are very strong adherents to the Second Amendment who will feel as though the conversation will be skewed against them. However, if it's about gun safety, responsibility, you're likely to bring in more people from the sort of the strong adherents to the Second Amendment and supporters of that. And that's the case with a whole host of issues. And I think that for staff within university that are part of like marketing and publications and communications, I think that those are areas to consider in terms of bringing a more sort of or fostering a more pluralistic university environment.
Yeah, and with that, since you brought up guns, given the recent series of Supreme Court decisions, have you thought about how your organization or universities or other institutions can kind of have those conversations, given that now, granted, this is happening during the summer, so universities, there's not many people there currently, but given there's such heated issues that decisions are being made about, have you thought about how to approach those with people you work with in a civil manner?
Not those in particular, since those are very, very fresh, fresh issues. But I found that It's really important just to hear other people's stories. I mentioned earlier that narratives do shape the way that we see the world. Where you sit is where you stand. And, I remember when I was a child growing up um, in Ghana. I was born and raised in Ghana, West Africa. When I was 9 years old, my parents took us on a trip to Germany. It was, my very first trip outside of the country, mine and my brother and my two sisters. On the very first day we arrived, we were incredibly excited. And the house in which we stayed, we looked across the window, we saw a playground that with the seesaws and the swings and everything that a kid would be excited about. And we just put on our shoes, we ran outside, but just about 6 feet before the edge of the playground, all the kids, about 7 or 8 of them, stopped. They stopped playing. They started to cry, and they were screaming the N-word at us. And we were shocked. We were just shocked, and then sad, and then just that sense that, we don't belong. And it was incredibly difficult for us. Fast forward 9 years later, when I visited the United States, I didn't know too much about the US at the time. I joked that, the only things I knew about the US was through the movies like Commando, Rambo, and Roots. And so I assumed that I wouldn't fit in. But I landed in Appleton, Wisconsin, where I went to college, Lawrence University, and I was welcomed with open arms. I was treated incredibly well. It really felt like home in many ways. And when I speak about my college experience, it's a very nostalgic feeling. It was a little town in Wisconsin, and it was a place where people said hi to you on the streets, and it was just wonderful. Now, in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd in May of 2020, we heard a lot of stories emerging about people's experiences and how the struggles, the discrimination, the prejudice, and so on. It was very different from my experience in the US, but it reminded me of my experience in Germany. And the idea was that, the stories, the narratives, they do shape our sense of belonging. They shape our views of the world. And in order to understand each other, in order to understand where we're coming from, and it doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everybody and what they're saying and their solutions to problems and so on, but just the opportunity to understand why people see the world the way they see it. There's always an opportunity. I was reading Monica Guzman's recent book, I Never Thought of It That Way. In that book, she says, curiosity is a great way to begin to learn about other people's stories. And there's always something that you don't know, right? So there are all these gaps in knowledge that we have. And she says, if you can get to a moment of, I never thought of it that way, that's a great improvement. So I think in the context of all the Supreme Court decisions, I think, people are very, very concerned, worried, angry. Some are celebrating as well. It's such an interesting moment, but we can hear each other's stories, and that might help us to get to that I never thought of it that moment, and I never thought of it that way moment. And it doesn't mean that we're going to agree with everything, but it would at least give us a sense of where people are coming from.
Yeah, I am fully, on board, a huge proponent of the power of stories. I think it's really important to just get to know people, learn where they're coming from, where they grew up, their experience with life. I think is really important when making connections with people. And thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I am glad to hear that it had a happy ending when you arrived here. So one place where we have a lot of these conversations is on social media. So social media is, restricted in how effectively you can tell your story, get to know others, and can be a quite toxic place to spend time. So one of the audience members has the question, is social media all bad right now? To Jonathan Haidt's point, which he described his views in a recent Atlantic article. Or can we actually practice real pluralism on Twitter, Facebook, etc.? I don't know how active you are on social media, but what's your take on that?
I'm on there, but I'm not very active. I think like everything else, there are its positives and negatives. Someone alluded to the fact that when the printing press emerged, we had a series of wars because of just the nature of how information was disseminated and the influences that it had. Social media is an interesting one, and as you noted, Jonathan Haidt has written a lot about this. I had a good conversation with Juliana Schroeder. She's a professor at UC Berkeley, and she's a psychologist who studies the psychology of interactions. And based on a lot of the studies that she's done, she notices that text-based communications can be dehumanizing. Excuse me. It has the potential for dehumanization because you don't see all the social cues, the responses, the emotion in people's voices or facial expressions. And sometimes we can treat each other very, very badly. There's the pylon, there's the, sometimes it seems like, WWE. So I think we're still learning the healthiest ways of interacting on social media because it's still fairly new. It's because there's a generation of people who have grown up on social media. I think there is a place, and it's important for people to have the experience of this in-person, face-to-face interaction. I think we have to kind of redevelop those skills again, especially for those who have not experienced it as much. It is no surprise that when we look at the surveys on trust, those who are 65 years old and above are more trusting of others, right? There's high levels of social trust. And then those between, I think, 18 and 29 have the lowest levels of trust. And according to the research, it tracks people who have low trust early on in their lives, continue that trend basically. So I worry that some of the activities and some of the interactions on social media contribute to this lack of trust, especially if you get attacked unfairly for something that you mistakenly said or inadvertently said. We kind of need more grace there. But yeah, I mean, on the other hand, social media has been great for people to meet friends, interact with people that they would otherwise not have. And it's helping to foster community in some sense. Now, there's a question as to whether those communities are form deep ties or thin ties. So, but we're still learning how to interact on social media. And I think so far, some of the stories that we're hearing have not been great. It seems like it's healthier if we take long breaks from social media from time to time.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually in a reading group, like a virtual reading group, and we use Slack to communicate when we're not like having our Zoom meetings. And someone brought up the question once, like, is this a real community? Would you consider it to be a real community? And some people brought up the idea of, well, can I call you and have you come help me? Well, no, because you're in California or whatever. So it is, interesting to think about the ways in which in-person versus online differ.
Yeah. Now I wonder how we would have done without the kind of technology and the platforms that we have, during the pandemic, if we didn't have these things. it's helpful, but it's just not the best substitute because nothing can replace the in-person interactions, it seems.
Yeah, yes, that seems to be the case. But yeah, at the same time, it was kind of a saving grace when we all
Yes,
were locked in our house.
absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. So getting back to pluralism, a question from an audience member. From an evolutionary point of view, I would argue that the importance of pluralism is similar to the importance of biological diversity, necessary for the survival of the species in following similar evolutionary mechanisms. What's your take on that view? Also noted, appreciating the fact that you do this live over the internet. Thank you. Greetings from Finland.
Great. I'm not an expert on evolutionary biology, but it seems like there are some relevant comparisons. You know, the cool thing about living in a democracy is the protections that you have for, you know, minority groups, minority viewpoints. And so there are things that are principle, so that even though the majority of people think a certain way, minority people have the chance to also live their lives, you know, freely. And so, you know, that's where I think human reason and rationality and principles and norms kind of mitigate against some of the more cutthroat aspects of evolutionary biology. So yeah, I mean, I think we should let reason, you know, rule the day. And the way to get to reason or reasonable views is to engage in this contestation and challenging one another in a free and equal society, that we all have a voice and we get to express them. It means that, you know, when we get to a certain conclusion, it may not be the final word, it may be the conclusion for now. We get to pick it up and push back and to challenge one another later on.
Yeah. And so this is going to be kind of switching gears, but we have an audience member. Just, sorry, reading this.
Sure. I'm excited. You have folks joining in from Finland and other places.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. That's one of the joys. Our audience spans the globe. So do you believe that institutions like the media and politics that seem to be positively benefited by primarily amplifying disparity and divisiveness can ever lead society towards pluralism, trust, positive relationships?
Perhaps not in their current, iterations. I think, and that's why I alluded to leadership and higher ed as being very, very important, because I think that we're going to have to kind of raise another generation of leaders who are thinking about institutions differently. Going back to Yuval Levin's point, institutions are meant to, you know, form us and adhere to certain values in society, whether it's toleration, it's viewpoint diversity, and all these things that are important virtues to aspire towards. But institutions have lost their way in many cases, where people are realizing that they're following a certain monoculture, and it's been very difficult to reflect a diversity of views and to allow others to be heard. I think in its current iteration, it would be difficult. But that's why I think it's always helpful to maintain a certain dose of optimism, that a certain future is possible, and the work starts now. It started a while back. It just needs to continue and ramp up, and I guess there's work to be done, but I think it's possible.
Okay, great. So I am going to pose one more question, and then we're going to go to our final question.
Mhm.
So when I express contrary opinions to the purposes of the academy, anything besides a strident assumption of social justice, I'm told that I'm not only naive, but I'm not keeping up with current theory on the foundations of the academy. I'm a communications professor, and I still can't figure out how to broach a conversation that doesn't paint me as just not heterodox, but unscholarly. Any suggestions?
Hmm. That's a hard one. I think I recently heard a conversation about sort of the different the origins of social justice, and how it seems as though people mean different things when they talk about social justice. And part of it is maybe just being concrete about what it is that we are fighting for or advocating for. But it is certainly difficult to be in an environment where, when you express your views, it's it's not welcomed, and it's kind of put down. And unfortunately, there are places where if especially you're the only person who is kind of helping to foster this kind of viewpoint diversity, it's going to be difficult. I think there is value in having a cohort of people who are involved in a certain effort. I think community is helpful, right? I mean, this is the sort of the other side of the coin. The community can be helpful in giving people a voice, giving them confidence. At the same time, it can be a place where tribalism grows. And so you always have to guard yourself against that. But when you are writing solo, if you will, it's always helpful to find a community of people who maybe share your views. And then I think by the encouragement, by the back and forth interactions, you learn new ways of engaging the environment around you. That would be my thought. I don't know if that's satisfying, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and obviously, Heterodox Academy, that's what we're trying to do, is provide that
Exactly.
community that people can come to, people who are different from them, but have kind of similar goals in what they're trying to do at universities.
So basically, they should join HXC as members.
Yeah, they might already be, but if not, yes, they should join.
If not, they should. Yes.
Okay, so for our final question, if institutions, especially universities, have lost trust, what specific steps could they take to regain trust?
I think someone said earlier that trust is earned, and so it will take a very long time to rebuild. I think it does take leadership to do that, a leader or a group of leaders who are committed to the liberal sensibilities and the liberal values, that the values that are required for a liberal education. And it means that Jonathan Rauch, in his book The Constitution of Knowledge, talks about two key things that are very, very important. One being fallibilism, that the notion that no one really has the final word on knowledge. Knowledge changes, it evolves, and we learn new things. And when we get new data, it should inform our knowledge, and it should help us improve upon our knowledge. And then empiricism being that we have to collect the data, we have to see if they match up with our theories, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are basic ideas that have been tried and tested within the scientific method. And I think if an institution wants to rebuild trust, and they have to adhere strongly to these types of things. I mean, obviously there's the Chicago Statement around free speech that I think is an important one to look at. but it does take a very long time to rebuild trust when it's been lost, especially with regards to an institution. And forming those attitudes, those norms, those mores, it's going to be one that has to be a burden shared by good, good leaders who are seeking to advance a free and equal and prosperous society.
Great, thank you. And that is a great note to end on. So I want to first thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the audience for all the great questions. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of them. But Ben, we really appreciate you not only joining us this evening, but attending the conference, having a great session there, and also for the work you do, which is obviously something we appreciate and is very much in line with our mission. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Have a great evening. Take care, everyone.
Mm-hmm.